about to ask you, why do you write about war?
Oh, please.
No.
Yes.
We'll come back to
yes.
that. We'll come back to that.
Yes.
Let me stay on the topic of you for a little bit. I'm always, and I'm sure this crowd too, many of them are theater students, and all of them are interested in drama.
Right.
How did they get interested? How did you get interested? Where did that first come? Was there a performance you saw as a child? Were your parents interested in theater? Where does the spark come from? Where does the connection come from?
I think I've always wanted to run away. I lived in 3 countries by the time I was 10. I was born in England. I lived there till I was 7. And I was one of those kids that always wanted to live in an imaginary world rather than the real one, And my favourite book was Peter Pan, and I used to read that a lot when I was 4 and 5. And at that young age, I took it very literally, and I thought, well, second to the left and straight on till morning. So I used to run away from home and get brought back by police, and my parents were very upset and worried, of course, but in fact, I was really just trying to go to a more magical world, so I think that, and then my family moved a lot, so we were always going to new places.
Creating new spaces.
So this dream that just around the corner would be a world that worked the way I wanted it to, that was more magical and more imaginative and more playful than the world I had to be in, which I found really boring mostly. That was a really big part of it. And then I think, I was in high school one day, early high school, and a theatre performance came to our school. It wasn't a good theatre performance, but I just sat there and I thought, this is what they do. They don't have to go out and be accountants and get jobs and have mortgages. They dress up in funny clothes and drive around the place and put on shows. I want to do that, and so that was kind of the moment. It was my escape route. I thought, I don't have to have a normal life. There is a life as an artist. I can see it out there, and I'm going to find it.
Nice work if you can get it.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, I think so.
Indeed.
Yes.
What you've said suggests something about the theater as a kind of liminal space.
Yes.
A place that is not the real world, but is in your work certainly very intimately related to the real world. And this is a term Robert Scanlon had used when writing about Trojan Barbie in the theater former.
Yes.
Issue 35, if anyone is interested. Could you say something about the theater as a liminal space, as a kind of a kind of psychic place for reconsideration? Yes. I guess what I'm really asking you is to say something about what you believe theater is for. Yes. Why is there theater?
Yes. Well, that's a kind of many-folded question. So I'm going to start at one place that could have been many places, and that is, I think, the human need for people to sit in the same room together. That this is a very old thing, and yet it's also a very uncomfortable thing. And I think increasingly so as we move into a more technologically related world. But I think something that I find really addictive about the theatre is that there's, on the one hand, there's imaginary space and time on stage, and on the other hand, there is the sweaty awkwardness of being in the same space with other living people, and the possibility that something might always go wrong. So those kind of roots in circus and terror and spectacle and game, I think really make the theatre come alive. So there's something uneasy and wonderful about the liveness, I guess. And in terms of the liminal space, for me it's a bit like the place between being in a dream and being awake, And I mean, people like different things in art, but for me, when I walk into the theatre and then I come out, or into any performance, what I really love is the feeling that that the world I walk out into looks different, that something inside of me has kind of moved, and that things look and feel different. And I'll give you an example of something that I really love about that, about something that only theatre can do, I think, instead of movies or TV, because of that liveness. It was a performance I saw in Sydney called Monster by Daniel McIver, wonderful Canadian artist. And the theatre was in complete darkness when it started. So everyone was sitting there in the dark, waiting for the lights to come up, and waiting for the lights to come up, and waiting for the lights to come up. And then we heard this very intimate voice, almost in our ears, sort of whispering, going, "Psst, I know you're out there." And it was this very, very menacing whisper that was speaking in a very intimate way in this darkness. And it took about 4 minutes for the lights to come up, just to that point of greyness that you have in the middle of the night when you wake up and you're not sure if you're awake or you're still in a dream, where your eyes start cutting shapes out of the dark. And I started seeing this monster on stage, also because of this whispering. And by the time the lights finally came up, there was a very plain-looking man in a grey outfit on stage. And by the end of the performance, I thought that he'd run all over the stage. But in fact, the lighting for that play was so sophisticated that in fact it was just his shadow that was thrown in all different directions all over the stage. And he said later he'd given himself the task of never stepping outside of a space about the side of this carpet for the whole show. And I thought he'd run all over the stage. So to me, that was one of the wonderful things that the theatre can do, of using the audience's imagination in a very active way to build the world of the play. And theatre's so vulnerable for that, because it doesn't work if that doesn't happen. Which is why it's such a frightening medium, because it can always go horribly wrong, and it so often does. Yeah.
Well, I suppose that's a good connection to the fact that playwright is spelled W-R-I-G-H-T,
yes.
right? It's
yes.
worked.
Yes.
It's not just written. Now, you spoke about your diving into the tunnel of writing and the
yes.
importance of the word itself, but
yes.
clearly you've mastered the art of all of the other theatrical elements that must be deployed. Where does that experience come from? Have you worked in the theater? Did you train as an actor? Have you directed yourself? How did you? Yeah. I know part of this is part of your academic preparation, your degrees.
I don't know how much of it really is, actually. Because,
well, tell. How did you learn how to do this?
Oh, well, I think when people are beginning to write plays, if you think of it as just a literary form, the plays tend to be very talky and overwritten, because that things I was saying about the body and the proximity of people in the theatre, that applies to writing for the stage too, that so much communication doesn't come from words. Right. And if you ever eavesdrop or just collect found dialogue, you'll find out how much people leave out, how much they interrupt each other, and how often in most conversations there's negotiation over status and objects. And those things are just very characteristic of almost all conversations, and they're almost never in early plays. People listen to each other and they say something, and then someone says something back, and they think about it and they say something back, and the audience has meanwhile nearly died of boredom, because people aren't like that in the real world. There's always negotiation over power, status and objects going on, and that's the animal side of human relationship.
Right.
So getting that on the page, I think, is about learning to write less. So in terms of your question about what have I actually done in the theatre, as I said, I started playing music and being in self-devised performances. And one of the first things I was ever in was a circus. It was a really bad circus. It was a women's circus, and it was we didn't have any animals or anything like that. We were sort of like a social critique comedy circus. And I really wanted to perform in the circus, but I was so bad at it that they made me learn an instrument and be in the band, and that's how I became a musician. But I learned a lot from that kind of tacky, have to make things work in any space theatre, and about those low impulses of fear and competition and what's going to happen next that drive the theatre. I really think if you don't have this question of what's going to happen next, you don't have a show. It doesn't matter if it's Ibsen or whether it's my play or whether it's a David Mamet play or whether it's performance art. If you don't have this what's going to happen next thing going on, no one cares and they'll go to sleep.